Hi, today I'm going to spend a minute or two responding to a specific question that I had from a student and their parents earlier this week. So actually, let me take a quick pause and say, if you have questions, we'd love to hear from you and we'd love to answer them for you, because that is what we are here to do, is to try to provide extra information around what we know can be a somewhat crazy and intense process, to say the least. So the question I was asked earlier this week was essentially, which test should I take, SAT versus the ACT? And this is coming from a younger student, actually just starting sophomore year of high school. So really on the very beginning phases of even doing standardized testing and thinking about how this process works and how it will play out for them in the long run. The second part of the question was, is one of the tests easier than the other? And there was an assumption on the parents' part that yes, the ACT is easier than the SAT. And so that is what they thought their child should be focusing on. So let's break it down a little bit. The two tests are, in this day and age, more similar than they used to be at one point. But let's talk about some of the key differences. So if you're familiar with what's going on in the world of standardized testing, you may already know that the SAT has already converted to being a fully digital test. And quite frankly, that appeals to some students and not to others. The ACT is available in a digital format in limited capacity, but it is still a paper test for the time being for the majority of students. So some students are going to prefer that type of test when it comes to making a decision about what their options are. In terms of the format or the sections involved, the SAT has two sections, a reading and writing section and a separate math section. The ACT has an English section, a math section, a reading section, and a science section, which has now become optional, and an optional essay. So, leaving some choices there on the table in terms of the different sections for the ACT. And guess what? Here's the question that everyone wants to know. What are colleges going to require? Well, they've mostly stopped requiring the essay. So our students haven't been taking the optional essay on the ACT for quite some time because colleges are not requiring that from them. Science, however, is still a bit up in the air. The state of Florida as a whole just came out and announced that they are not going to require that as part of their students' ACT score calculations. But we don't know definitively across the board what other schools are going to say just yet. I think over time, the next few months, we're going to learn more, certainly over the course of this year. So my advice right now for students taking it is go ahead and take the science, because you don't know definitively where you're applying and what their policies will be, and you would hate to take a test that was a good score otherwise, but you weren't able to use it because it didn't have science as part of the ACT with that. Other differences or even similarities. Let's talk about the content, especially when it relates to math. On the SAT, the content is very focused on algebra and problem solving. The reading passages relating to reading and writing are shorter, so they emphasize vocabulary instead of grammar and things like that as much. Whereas on the ACT, it covers math topics all the way up to pre-calculus. And then in English, there are more grammatical type questions, punctuation specifically. The reading passages are longer on the ACT, and certainly with the science section, those are reading-based passages that you have to read related to a science problem. So lots of reading, I guess I would point out, in terms of the ACT. Timing-wise, they're now very similar. SAT is 2 hours and 14 minutes long. The ACT is 2 hours and 55 minutes long without the writing. So very similar time-wise. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that if a student is a strong math student, one thing to think about is the SAT, half of the score is based on math. because English and reading are combined into one section. So that may be something to think about as students are trying to decide which is the better test for them. So something to consider there. Now that may be shifting as the ACT shifts and with the other sections becoming optional, but we're still going to have a separate English section, a separate reading section, and a separate math section. So there'll still be 3 sections there to consider. The SAT is a little bit slower paced. It offers more time per question. The ACT has always been known for going a little more quickly. So depending on your students' ability to stay focused and move through things quickly, that may make a difference in terms of which test is better for them. The new digital version of the SAT also does what we call adaptive testing. So it changes the difficulty of the questions depending upon how the student is doing up to a certain point. So I do think that is where this particular parent was coming from when we had our conversation earlier this week, is that the ACT isn't changing like that. So the ACT questions on paper, they're going to be what they are going to be. But it could get harder if you're doing well on the SAT as it moves along. The flip side of that is if you're doing well and it's getting harder, you are on target to earn a higher score overall, because if it doesn't get harder, you're staying at a lower level, and that's factored into the score evaluation down the road. So is one easier than the other? No, not really. It all depends on a student's skill set, their confidence level with taking standardized testing, strengths in math versus verbal. Strong students with great reading comprehension skills have always done really well on the ACT and will continue to do so. My best advice is, as students are exploring their options, especially if they are younger, they should take both tests. If they're going into 10th grade, they could take a diagnostic version of each one. Doesn't get reported anywhere. It is simply a retired version of the SAT and ACT. They can arrange to do that through us. We have a variety of connections with test prep folks who can offer those diagnostic tests, so students can start to genuinely see which one is going to be better for them in the long run. If they're already entering junior year and they're starting to map out their testing plan, then why not register for one of each? Find out also what is being offered by your school district, if anything. Some school districts offer one or both tests as a normal part of their junior year curriculum, so to speak. So find out what is out there, and my advice, again, get exposure to both so that you can make a real educated decision with your child about what is going to be the better test overall. And don't fall for the blanket rumors and myths that one is simply harder or easier than the other, because our test takers have different skill sets and different strengths, and we want to try to figure out the test that is going to highlight those in the best possible way.